You're from the Bronx, right?
Yes, I am.
So you all have two New Yorkers here. You all have to forgive me a little bit too, because I'm a little disoriented. I just came back from Thailand on a visit to meet with officials about their drug policy and what's happening in that country. And it's not very different from what's happening in this country in terms of the injustices that happens to people who use drugs. It's just that in Thailand, they don't have the nuance or the public relations that we have in this country. So we are a little more sophisticated in what we do with drug. We're more sophisticated in the harms that we do with our drug policies. Like what we do is we elect a black president and feel good about that and don't do shit about drug policy. And we feel good about that. Whereas they don't have the sophistication to do that sort of thing. But the net result for the people who get caught up are the same. And part of why people get caught up in bad policies is because of this notion that I'm going to talk about today. Although we didn't think this originally. My title is Addiction as a Brain Disease, a catchy distraction that is facilitating social injustice. I'm going to show you why I make this claim. I only have 25 minutes, and I just realized I only had 25 minutes last night. Thank you, Pam. I had longer, but that's okay. But that's all right. Let's do this. I'm gonna go kind of quickly, but I'm also doing one of the breakout sessions, and so we can follow up and we can ask more in-depth questions about it. This is me back in the 90s in doing my dissertation in an NIH lab where my goal was to try to understand the neurobiological mechanisms responsible for drug addiction. I grew up in the hood. This, for you all who missed this slang about 20 years ago, just simply mean from a community in which there were limited resources and it was predominantly black. I believed that crack cocaine was destroying the community, and I thought that one way I could contribute was to try to figure out the underlying neural mechanisms responsible for crack addiction. That is, if I can solve crack addiction, I can cure the problems of crime, poverty, and all those things that they said were caused by crack cocaine. So I went to the lab and I put in all the work. I worked 18, 20 hours a day trying to figure this out. Learned about the brain, tried to figure out the regions that we thought were important for reward, and drug reward specifically. These regions like the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. We learned about dopamine, and we learned how important dopamine is, and all those sorts of things. We believed all that. The National Enquirer, everybody was talking about dopamine. Even though dopamine only represents less than 1% of the brain neurotransmitters. We talked about dopamine as having this important function, but it's okay. Throughout the years of publishing dozens of scientific papers under this theory, trying to figure out dopamine's role, I tested a number of drugs to try to manipulate dopamine activity in cocaine addiction, methamphetamine addiction, all of these sorts of things, and it just didn't work. I was trying to figure it out. Studied animals, laboratory animals, studied humans, just didn't work. So back in about 2011 or 10, I thought I would write a book to try to figure it out, kind of see where I had gone and what I'd done. I tried to put it all together. Tried to put together what I thought was my education. Thought that I would share my education with the public. Turns out, as I was putting together this book, I was the one who got an education. And then I was reminded of the words of James Baldwin when James Baldwin said, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated." There it is. That was the problem. The problem wasn't in the brains of people who use drugs. The problem was our fucking society. Now I should take a step back because I want us to all be on the same page as we think about knowledge, because this is what this is about, evidence. And when we think about drugs, there are multiple ways in which we know what we know. There are multiple ways of knowing. One of the most important ways that we know something is from anecdote. Anecdotes are those sort of personal accounts of those incidents that we relay to others. We tell people these great stories. Anecdotes are excellent for getting people to connect, getting people to remember. You remember those great stories that your professors told in class, for example. You don't remember some of the details, but you remember those stories. Those stories help you to remember the principles. They are excellent. Anecdotes are excellent. But there's a problem with anecdotes. We have to be careful, because we can't tell whether or not these stories are outliers or are they representative cases. So someone can tell you a story about someone who smoked marijuana, for example, and then they went and killed their mother because they smoked marijuana. You will remember that story because that story is memorable. In fact, that story went around quite a bit in the 1930s, and we believed it. And then it came back in the 1990s in places like here, where people talked about people using methamphetamine, and then they go out and kill somebody. And then we believe it. But we don't know if that story is representative. But we certainly remember it, and we certainly retell it, right? So anecdote is one way to know something. There's another way of knowing things: empirical evidence. Empirical evidence comes from experiments, measurable observation. These are reliable. And these experiments are designed to avoid the kind of bias that I was talking about with anecdote. They come from doing experiments, manipulating independent variables, testing them over and over to make sure that you have a connection between cause and effect. Now, empirical evidence, of course, is valued, particularly in science. When we talk about evidence-based, we're talking about empirical evidence. We're not talking about anecdote. Now, in my book, High Price, I use a lot of anecdote to connect with the reader, because I know the reader doesn't want to just hear a boring scientific paper. But that anecdote is bolstered, supported with empirical evidence. Otherwise, it has no place in my book. So anecdote combined with empirical information can be powerful. But anecdote without empirical information is just somebody telling you their opinion. And it has no place in public policy. But we know that anecdote is how public policy is made, because the senators or the congresspeople who tell great stories, they're persuasive. But it doesn't mean that what they're saying is grounded in reality or evidence. They just happen to be persuasive. The lovely thing about science is that it's the great equalizer. You don't have to be charismatic. If you've heard a scientist speak, you know this is true. You don't have to be charismatic. You don't have to be wealthy. You just need the evidence. It's the great equalizer. All right, so we understand how we know things, and we understand what we value, what I value. I value empirical information. Now let's think about public health. That's just because this is a popular sort of notion, a popular saying that is stated in the harm reduction community. We oftentimes say things like, we would much prefer to have treatment over jabs. You even get this on Capitol Hill now. When you start to have these sayings be so popular that they're on Capitol Hill, red flag, red flag, red flag. So what does this mean, this public health approach? What does this mean? treatment over jails. You should know that the vast majority of people who use drugs don't have a problem. So drug use is not drug abuse. 75 to 90% of the people who use drugs like methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, they don't meet criteria for addiction or the DSM criteria for substance use disorder. They're just users. They're just like the last 3 presidents of the United States who all used illegal drugs. They're just like me who use illegal drugs. You go to work, you take care of your family, you pay your bills. You are a responsible person in the society. That is the vast majority of people who use drugs. So what is this notion that we'd rather have people be in treatment than jail? I don't need treatment, especially if you all know what happens in some of those places. Most people don't need treatment. So what does that mean? This public health approach. What does it mean? Another thing that we need to keep in mind too, as we think about drugs, is that drugs are not good or bad. Sometimes we get into this frame. Drugs, harm reduction, just the term harm reduction. We talk about harm reduction, so we start from this negative perspective, as opposed to saying, well, we're into enhancing positive effects of drugs. Instead, we're reducing the harms. When I came here in a car, I put on a seatbelt. That was harm reduction, but we don't call it harm reduction. I brushed my teeth this morning. We don't call that harm reduction, but we have to call it harm reduction for drugs. Something's wrong with that. Drugs are not good or bad. We think about cocaine. Cocaine is an excellent local anesthetic. Without cocaine, we don't have Novocaine. Novocaine is just a slight modification of the cocaine chemical. Methamphetamine is an excellent attention deficit disorder medication. It is approved for that purpose. It's excellent for people who are going to war. Militaries have used methamphetamine. Our military still use D-amphetamine. Methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, of course, are the same drug, except methamphetamine has that additional methyl group that doesn't seem to do much in humans, at least not in our studies or other people's studies. So drugs are not good or bad. We have to think about the context in which they are taken. So when we start to talk about drugs in terms of being good or bad, we've already lost. All right. So again, when we think about this public health approach, we have to remember most of the people who use drugs don't need treatment. So what should we do? Well, I'm suggesting that we should probably think about it like we think about driving. We think about driving when people screw up, and people do. They drive their cars too fast, they may get in accidents or what have you. We don't send people to jail for driving their cars too fast. Simply because they're driving their car too fast, what we do is we implement harm reduction strategies, or we implement decriminalization strategies where someone might receive an administrative fine or a warning. I'm suggesting that we can do the same sort of thing with drugs. We should do the same sort of things with drugs, because when you drive an automobile, you can actually kill somebody. Just like some people, when they do drugs and they do it improperly, they can actually kill themselves or hurt themselves. Similar sort of things, when people engage in sexual activity, they can actually put themselves at risk where somebody dies. But we have not banned those activities. We have not banned sex. Well, not in this day, have we? We certainly haven't banned driving. So when we think about driving, we have these harm reduction strategies. We ask people to wear seatbelts. We have an age requirement. We have speed limits. We have all of these things to make the activity more safe and enjoyable for folks, to make sure the activity is available for folks who will engage in that activity. We can do the same thing with drugs. With drugs, we can decriminalize drugs, we can have age requirements, and if we're really talking about a public health perspective with drugs, you cannot be talking about a public health perspective with drugs seriously if you do not have free drug testing purity centers. That is, testing to see if the drugs are pure of adulterants. The drugs themselves are not that big of a deal. We know what these drugs do. I have given thousands of doses of drugs like methamphetamines as part of my research, and thanks to your tax dollars. We know what these drugs do. But the adulterants in some of these drugs are more concerning. So if you're going to talk about a public health perspective, you cannot be serious unless you have free drug purity testing, like they do in Spain, like they do in some other countries. And then, of course, you can do a number of the other things that you guys are already doing, like needle exchange, condoms, supervised drug-using facilities, a wide range of things. And of course, you have to do better education. You have to have better drug education, and the education cannot be delivered by police officers. No disrespect to police officers. No disrespect. It's just that, by the way, I was a cop in the military. I was a cop in the military. I did 4 years in the Air Force. So no disrespect to police officers. But when I was a cop, I had no skill, no pharmacology skills. And to have me give drug education would be like having Donald Trump be president. I'm sorry. I'm joking. The guy won Ferris brother. That's a joke. But you get the point. I would not be qualified to do drug education when I was a cop. And the same is true now. The people who do drug education should actually know something about pharmacology, should actually know something about behavior, should actually know something about what's age appropriate. All of those sorts of things. So you can't just put anyone out there doing drug education. Now, let's get to this issue of drug addiction as a brain disease. What does it mean? What do I mean? I simply mean that there are neurobiological substrates that differentiate non-addicted persons from those who are addicted. So we can tell by looking at the brains of those who are addicted versus those who are not. And sometimes when you go to conferences where you have scientists, they will put a pretty picture on the board like this. This is a PET imaging. If you focus your attention on the left, that's the image of someone who's never taken methamphetamine. On the right, that's a picture of someone who's taken methamphetamine. The picture on the left is slightly brighter than the picture on the right. And the brightness is related to dopamine binding, or an indirect measure of dopamine binding. And someone will tell you, you clearly see the difference. You really don't, but they will tell you can clearly see the difference, and you will be fooled into believing that these are data. These are not data. These are just reconstructed statistical graphs. These are not data. Here are the data. These are the data. If you focus your attention on the circles, these are the individuals. These are individuals. Each circle represents one individual. Individuals who have never used methamphetamine. The triangles are individuals who use methamphetamine. And this is binding for dopamine receptors in the midbrain region. What you can see clearly here is that there is more potential binding of the dopamine receptors in the individuals who never use methamphetamine, the circles. That's what you can see. There's about a 10 to 20% difference. What some people will say is that, oh, clearly this shows that methamphetamine causes some damage to dopamine cells, so you get more binding in those people who don't use the drug. That's what they would say. But that's not. That would be a logical error, because what we know is that we don't know what was there beforehand, before the persons used methamphetamine. We don't know what was there. That's one thing. And number two, what you see is a tremendous amount of overlap between the groups. That is, some of the people in the methamphetamine use group have more binding potential than some of the people in the group that never used methamphetamine. So this could just be within the normal range of human variability. Do we get it? So one way to try and get at this whole thing, after looking at this sort of effect, is to try to have some behavioral measure that will differentiate these people from the methamphetamine users from the controls. cognitive testing, movement, some sort of behavioral measure that will differentiate them. Now, a few years ago, we did a comprehensive review of the neuroimaging literature and the cognitive literature of methamphetamine users. This was the sort of best place to look for brain differences among drug abusers or drug users. What we found was that there was virtually no data showing that methamphetamine users' brains' cognitive function was different than those people who never used the drug. This paper was published in Neuropsychopharmacology. You can go check it out. When you look at the evidence of brain disease for substance abuse, it does not compare anywhere near like when you look at the evidence for other brain diseases like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease, where you can see clear differences in those folks who have that illness and people who don't have that illness. So the notion of drug addiction being a brain disease is not based on evidence. It's based on a catchy sort of phrase. It's based on something that sounds nice. It's based on political reasons. People say, well, we need people to take us seriously, so we have to say it's a brain disease. That's not evidence. It's not based on any evidence. So what does this mean? What's the problem? What's the problem as I see it? Why not just allow people to have this? And then we can say it's a brain disease, Congress will take you more seriously. What's the problem with that? Well, let's think about this. If the real problem with drug addiction, for example, is the interaction between the drug itself and the individual brain, then the solution to this problem lie in one of two approaches, right? One approach would be we simply remove the drug from society through policies, law enforcement, and that way you don't have this interaction between the drug and the brain. Another solution is that we can focus exclusively on the individual and try to protect their brain, remedy their brain, just focus on that individual. The problem is, in both cases, there is neither need nor interest in understanding the role of social or environmental factors in maintaining drug use or mediating drug addiction. So the social role, the environmental roles, there's no reason to even look at that. And when we know the vast majority of people who are addicted they become addicted because of things like co-occurring psychiatric illnesses. They become addicted because of these environmental and social factors. They become addicted because of limited opportunities. All of these social environmental factors. So the brain disease model shifts our focus away from what's really important to something that we have almost no evidence to support. That's the problem. And since we are near Martin Luther King's day, I want to remind us of what Martin Luther King said at the Riverside Church in New York in '67, I believe, when he said he was against the Vietnam War. He said, let's be clear. By the way, this is the time where this is the time of the year where I hate most, where people misquote Martin Luther King, particularly dumb people. They misquote him to fit their naive sort of perspective. King was radical. Martin Luther King said that he was against the Vietnam War simply because it took away money from poor people. It took away resources from poor people. I am against this notion that drug addiction is a brain disease because that's where all the money is going. It's taking away money and resources from areas in which we know can improve the lives of people who are disadvantaged. We know this, and we do it anyway. So I'm in the spirit of Martin Luther King, truly. Now I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to say what we can do as a group. What we can do as a group. These things I call the 3 C's. As a group, we must have some convictions. We must have these firmly held beliefs. And we must have these beliefs be informed. Now, and we must have capacity, know-how. You have to know the science. You have to be exceptional, particularly if you have the microphone, if you have the public's attention. Know what you're talking about. Know your stuff. If you don't, if you're not prepared, that's okay. Take the time to get prepared before getting the microphone. Know your stuff because the stakes are too high. And this is most important, you must have courage. You cannot be a coward. And part of having courage is getting out of the closet about your own drug use. When you get out of the closet about your own drug use, we normalize this behavior. We show people that folks who use drugs are not the caricatures that we see in the public service announcements. We let people know that the folks who use drugs, in many cases, in some cases, become people who are respected in our society, like our presidents. And you may have to be impolite. Sometimes you might have to be impolite, unfortunately. And I try not to be impolite, but you may have to. The situation may call for that. And you should be willing to lose funding, as I have. Friends, professional achievements, respect, all of these sorts of things, you must be willing to lose. And you must understand that your judge is history. Not even the persons before you, but your judge is how history will judge you. Now, I should say, before I close, that this is not a formula for popularity. If you're hoping to run for a political office, this is probably not the strategy for you. But if you're hoping to do the right thing, and to be able to look in the mirror and know that you took care of your fellow citizens, this is the ticket. Thank you very much.